of radical self-respect. Today we're going to go over a big topic, narcissistic parents. And it's hard to go over this specifically because there's so many different kinds and there's so many different versions of their temperaments. For example, there's religious narcissistic parents, there's spiritual narcissistic parents, there's military narcissistic parents, police narcissistic parents, teachers, uh, college professors, former athletes, former musicians, or current musicians. There's all sorts. And what I'm going to try to do in this is just break down some of the common themes and some of the things that you see. But even amongst narcissists in general, they can have different temperaments. For example, not all of them will be as philandering as others will be. Some of them will be more absent in their parenting style. Others will be too much in their parenting style and they'll be smothering and too controlling. But we're going to break it down, all of this. So, the two kinds of narcissistic parents. There's a mom that can be narcissistic and a dad that can be narcissistic. And what often happens is the children are extensions of themselves. And sometimes you'll see them showing off their kids like they're trophies because a lot of it is about image to them. A lot of it is they had kids to get their own needs met, not to help those kids become their own person. And the way this manifests is the narcissistic parent will have fantasies for their children. And they will say, okay, we want you to be this. We want you to be this professional athlete, or we want you to follow in your mom or dad's footsteps to be this kind of business owner or musician or whatever it may be. And that's how you know something's a little off, where they're not trying to help you develop yourself. They have a path laid out for you that they want you to follow. And if you do not follow that path, there's going to be hell to pay. And the hell will be guilt, shame, being criticized, etc. But depending on the version of parent it is, this can all look a little bit different. So the religious ones, they will be all hell and high water fury, for lack of a better word, and they can be very controlling in a moralistic way. And often it's rules for thee, but not for me in some of their cases, but not all the time. But either way, when they're super controlling like that, it is abrasive and they're going to be wanting you to live a certain way. And if you don't live by that religious code of conduct that they want you to live by, they'll be very upset. Now, the spiritual narcissists, they're a little bit different. And a lot of them can be like the new age coaches or the yogis, etc. Now, their version of spiritual narcissism as a parent can look a little bit different. And it can be sneaky and subtle, but it's still controlling. And they'll still find a way to manipulate you and to make you think your boundaries are wrong and to find a way to disrespect you or make you disrespect yourself. And all of this is pretty tough because when you're a kid, this is your primary caregiver. It's not easy to live in that kind of dynamic. But when your primary caregiver is a narcissist, it sets the foundation for not a very good time. And the elements, again, control will be one of the big elements for sure. Then another one will be the feeling of having to walk on eggshells. And this happens because they have this controlling and critical energy where it's not really lighthearted a lot of times. Even in the spiritual ones, you would think they would be a little more lighthearted, but it's not. And the police families and the military families, very structured and rigid in those cases. But in all of them, this is going to be this tense undercurrent. And if you take a step back and you go to the extended families, often you will see similar dynamics in their families because this is a generational thing where if there's a narcissistic parent, they have children that either become narcissists themselves or black sheeps or codependents or just overall like maybe they can turn borderline too. But if they get with a person that's a narcissist or they're the narcissist themselves, that's how this stuff continues. And it continues through the generations. And if you take a step back, if you look at your situation and you were dating a narcissist and maybe one of your parents was, Then you take a deeper step back, a bigger step back, and what do you see? You might see it all throughout your family tree. I call this a sixth sense moment, but that's the dynamic that might be around. Now, when there's multiple children, usually the narcissistic parent has a favorite, and that's called the golden child. And the golden child is the one that lives in accordance to the way the narcissistic parent wants to live. They are the kid that lives up to that ideal the most. Now, that gives the narcissistic parent, or this gives the golden child, it gives them a lot to live up to. And there's benefits to being the golden child, and there's certainly downfalls too. But then the other kids might be the scapegoated kid, or they can be a lost child, etc. And the narcissistic parent, one of the sneakier and dirtier things they'll do a lot of times is they pin the siblings against one another. And it's really awful that they do this, but one of the ways they will do this is they'll talk to a kid about the other kid, and they'll say, why is your brother or sister doing this? Or why can't your brother and sister be more like you? And they usually have a favorite that they'll vent to, and they parentify them a little bit. Parentifying means you treat them like an adult and you confide in them in a way that you shouldn't be confiding in children. But that's one of the things they will do. And again, there's going to be subtle intricacies here between male narcissists and female narcissists, but the general underlying theme of the disorder is going to be the same. So with a narcissistic father, for example, some of them are going to be more into cheating and philandering, but not all, but a lot of them will be. And the ones that are into philandering, that's where they're getting their supply from. And that's a big thing to take a look at here too. How do they get their supply? The religious narcissist may get their supply from controlling others and trying to be the ideal whatever religion they are. The spiritual narcissist, they may get their supply by trying to be the most egoless, or maybe they have a social media following, or they have a following of people that look up to them. That's their version of supply. Maybe the college professor narcissist, they want to get tenure and they want to get published citations. They want to be able to write articles that get recognized by their peers. And that's their version of supply. And they want their kids to live up to that. The athletes, they want their kids to be an athlete. And then maybe hopefully be a professional athlete. Or the ones who want to be musicians, they want them to follow in those footsteps. But how they get their supply will be big. So a narcissistic father that's going to cheat, he might not be that present with the kids. He might see the kids as more of an annoyance in this case. But that's why I say there's different versions of narcissists. Not all narcissists will be the same. They might have different temperaments. They might have different things they value. And they might have different main sources of supply. For a narcissist whose main source of supply is, say, money and power, maybe it's going to be a little bit different. And they have a kid that they want to follow in their footsteps, and they'll be very judgmental, pushy, bullying, and controlling over their kids. But that person's present, though, right? And maybe they also can have affairs on the side as well. It really just depends. And I see the same dynamic with women, where there's the really smothering and controlling mother that has a little bit of a different dynamic when it's a daughter relationship with the mother versus a son relationship with the mother. A lot of the son and mother relationships, they get a little bit too close, where there's a lot of enmeshment. There can be some parentification. And I've seen some of them get a little too close for comfort, where the boundaries are blurred. And for those of you who don't know, enmeshment is when the boundaries between individuals is a little bit blurred, and they kind of turn into one big blob, where it's like a big unit, and they're subscribed to a distorted version of reality. And if you step out of line, they don't like that one bit. So those are the things to look out for with that. But regardless, if it's a male narcissist or a female narcissist, they're going to have those basic elements, or it wouldn't be narcissistic personality disorder. Like if they don't meet 5 of the 9 traits, they wouldn't be a narcissist. Now, again, I do believe there is a spectrum of this too, and depending on where they fall on the spectrum of narcissism, the severity of the traits that they will do will be more or less severe. A lot of it will depend. But back to the sibling rivalries. They often create these sibling rivalries and they triangulate with them, which is really a shame. And sometimes the siblings can get through it, other times they won't, and they begin to not like each other because the narcissistic parent pinned them against one another, which is pretty rotten. But overall, they don't like their kids making their own choices. And they have their favorite person that is usually living up to their ideal or the fantasy they have for them. And the other kids, they're the problem child. If it's a borderline parent, for example, they have the all good child and then the no good child. Narcissistic parents have a similar dynamic, but not quite the same. But either way, they don't like autonomy in their children. They don't like living and let live. They don't like when you do things that they wouldn't do. And I'm not talking about big moral issues here. I'm just talking about different preferences where they do not want to see you have different preferences. They want you to be like them and offer perfect mirroring. And regardless of how that part goes down, though, they will be very upset if they don't go a certain way. They want you to go down their path and give them that mirroring. But if you don't, they'll be really upset. And that's where the controlling and critical part comes in. So like I said, there's a lot going on in this dynamic, and there's so many different ways to go about it because there's so many different varieties. There's so many different varieties, so many different temperaments. But overall, it does condition children to associate the behaviors of a narcissist with love. And at that point, when the kids grow up, and a lot of times they can be more likely to get an anxiety disorder too when they grow up because they have that constant bombarding. But every kid, they're going to respond to this a little bit differently too. There's going to be the kids that really try to get the parents' approval and they're always chasing it, even though the parent keeps on moving the goalposts and they keep on pushing them harder and harder. That's one dynamic. Or it can be more of a black sheep dynamic where the kid decides to unsubscribe and do their own thing. And the narcissistic parent gets pretty resentful of that, but the black sheep unsubscribed. They unsubscribed from the distorted version of reality. And the people who are in that reality, they resent that. And they get threatened by the fact that that person did that. So they try to rope them back in. But how the kids respond to this as well can be different. And some of them, they turn into narcissists themselves. I've seen that happen in ways where they were really spoiled rotten and they were treated like they can do no wrong. I've seen those kind of kids turn into narcissists, and the ones that are neglected or had some sort of big bad event happen or some trauma, they turn into narcissists sometimes too. But in the case that it's a codependent or an empath, for example, those kids, they associate the behaviors of their narcissistic parent with love, and they continue to try to chase that narcissistic parent's love and approval. The problem is, it is always elusive. They can never quite grasp it. There's always something else they need to be doing better. And they recreate this in their adult relationships. I'm going to be interviewing someone who specializes in attachments, and we're going to go over if someone consistently keeps on attracting the same kinds of people, that usually means there's some sort of attachment wound that they're struggling with. And usually it's an anxious attachment. And a lot of people who have an anxious attachment, I bet you were more likely to have a narcissistic parent because their love and approval was fleeting and love had to be earned and those kinds of dynamics. And if you didn't perform a certain way, you didn't get their love. And it's sad, but that's exactly how it can go down. And just like in a romantic relationship, the narcissistic parents can give intermittent rewards from love bombing and treating you well to devaluing and then back to love bombing. And it sets you up for that kind of dynamic. It's a little bit unpredictable in a predictable kind of way. So the unpredictable part is you never know what kind of mood they're going to be in. The predictable part is you can see it if you take a big step back. But as kids, you don't know that. You don't know how it's going to be, but that is how it is. And then one of the consequences is a lot of times they can develop an anxiety disorder. If someone was the golden child and then they turn into the scapegoat, They actually think that's one of the causes of borderline personality disorder. I should cite that where I read that, but that is one of the things, which would make sense. If one of your primary caregivers splits on you like that, and they go from treating you as the golden child to all of a sudden you're the scapegoat, not a good feeling. And what does that do to you internally? It makes you think love is not something you can rely on, even from a primary caregiver. And what do we know about borderlines? They have that fear of abandonment and the fear of smothering and engulfment and losing themselves. And that's congruent with having a narcissistic parent because they don't want them too close, because if they're too close, they might go. They might go, and they push them away before that abandonment can happen. But if they get too far away before that even occurs, then the fear of abandonment comes in with that too. But that's what can happen with this. So the kid that was a codependent, he might recreate or she might recreate the dynamic in those kinds of adult relationships. And healing the attachments. Monday afternoon, I'm going to be talking about this with Bree is her name. And she's a doctor. She's a PhD in psychology, which is pretty interesting. And we're going to be talking about this very dynamic. But if you don't heal those attachments, your partner will turn into your parent. You got to heal from those wounds and from those traumas. And how do you do that? I know I talk a lot about narcissism here and narcissistic parents and the toxic things to watch out for, but how do you heal that? That's a good question, isn't it? A lot of it is learning how to be on our own, having goals, feeling our feelings, trying to develop a full life, not stuffing or suppressing anything, not numbing out in some sort of addiction in one way or the other, but owning who we are and accepting sometimes healthy can be a little boring. It's not going to be the chaos and the emotional roller coasters of those emotional highs and those emotional lows. But that is what you get. In a narcissistic kind of relationship, that's what you get. And when you had a narcissistic parent, it conditions you to think that kind of thing is normal. And that's a problem, of course. And in my coaching practice, I see this a lot. I see women that they go from one kind of guy to the next that's very similar. And sometimes it can be grandiose narcissist to covert narcissist, but at the core is still a narcissist, whether it's grandiose or covert. Admittedly, the coverts will be much more difficult to detect, but we gotta heal those wounds in ourselves. If we don't heal from what cut us, we'll bleed on those who didn't. And that's hard, but I think it is doable. And then when we see, yes, we do deserve to be treated well, and it starts with us. How do we treat ourselves? When people see how we treat ourselves, they will know, hey, that person isn't going to put up with any BS. And they will be much less likely to give BS as well. But I don't want to pretend this is an easy process. There's a lot of moving parts to it. There's the spiritual component, mental health component, just having quality relationships, your physical health. There's many moving parts, the community aspect. And of course, having a narcissistic parent doesn't help with any of this. I think a lot of kids of narcissistic parents are more likely to try to self-medicate with some sort of a addiction in one form or another. It doesn't have to be drugs or alcohol, but it can be love addiction, sex addiction, porn. People can escape to porn or something else as they're growing up, if you're a dude in particular. But these are the things that can happen. And I was thinking about the other day, there's a massive discrepancy where if you had a narcissistic parent and that's your primary caregiver, that's how you grow up, you were brought up with someone like that, you can be in a completely different place 30 years down the line than someone who had a healthy and emotionally supportive parent. Because the narcissistic parent, their support is usually conditional. And it's conditional upon, are you living the way they want you to live? And if you are, you'll get support and you'll be praised. But if you don't, then you'll be criticized, guilted, and shamed. It's not okay to have your own thoughts and opinions in that kind of dynamic. It's not okay to have personal boundaries where if you don't want to do something, you're taught you should ignore your gut. You should ignore what you think about the situation, and you need to just push through. And granted, there's a time for doing that in the adult world, but when it's a parent doing this to their child, they learn what? Their feelings don't matter. Their needs don't matter. And it's a painful situation for them to be in. And they bring that with them. They think, yep, I feel this way, but I was taught by my parent I should not pay attention to that feeling. I have to push through it because my feelings and my needs, they're not as important. And in those narcissistic family dynamics, there's usually one person's feelings who are the most important. And everyone else, they take a back seat to that most important person. And again, there's varying levels of abuse too in these narcissistic family dynamics. There's some that are extremely abusive, some that are mildly abusive, some can be physically abusive, some can be sexually abusive. It really depends. There's a spectrum of that aspect too. But regardless, they wouldn't be a narcissist if they didn't treat you poorly at least some of the time. Because if they didn't treat you poorly sometimes, they probably wouldn't be a narcissist after all. But even if it's not a narcissist, there's other versions of abusive people too. There's just people who can be a jerk. There's people that can be an a-hole, as I like to call it. And again, what's an a-hole? For those who don't know, an a-hole is someone that does one or more a-hole behaviors consistently. That's what I call a diagnosed a-hole. And an a-hole behavior is something that's either extremely selfish, rude or obnoxious, or inconsiderate. Cheating is an example of an a-hole behavior. Lying is an example of an a-hole behavior. Taking advantage of others or exploiting them is an example of an a-hole behavior. But those are things to watch out for too. Maybe a parent was just one of those things and they weren't a full-blown narcissist. That's always possible as well. But in these kinds of situations, it can be pretty painful. And sometimes, depending on how severe the narcissistic parent is, you might be able to smooth things over a little bit, and you don't always have to go no contact. But other times, I don't think it's even possible. I think they are just too far gone, the narcissistic parent, and they're too draining on your energy and abusive when you're around them. And in those cases, I would say the best thing to do usually is to get rid of them. But I don't want to pretend like that's always how it's going to be. That's not always how it is. There are some times when maybe they're a little lower on the narcissistic spectrum. You don't have to cut them off completely. You can kind of just manage them in small doses. And that's something that I see people do too. But if you take a step back in your family dynamic, you can see this. You can see through the generations. There's a narcissistic parent. Look at those kids. They either were a narcissist themselves or they were the more codependent one. The more codependent ones get with the narcissist. The narcissist, they find another codependent. And the pattern can continue. And that's the pattern that can continue indefinitely until someone puts their foot down. But another good example of what happens in the narcissistic families is like what Chester Bennington said in the song Numb from Linkin Park. Every step that I take is another mistake to you. Now, and that is true. That's how they can roll with things where if you're not living in accordance to what they want, no good. But another good note in that song at the end that gets a little less attention is, and I know that you were just like me with someone disappointed in you. To me, that means if you had a narcissistic parent, chances are one of their parents was narcissistic too. And they might have even have treated them worse than your narcissistic parent treated you. And that's not to say anything they did was okay. It doesn't make anything they did acceptable. But it is an explanation. An explanation is not an excuse. But I find that explanations do help me with acceptance. And that's another big thing. Forgiveness and your narcissistic parents. That can be a hard one depending on how severe it was. And I think people mess up forgiveness sometimes too. But forgiveness does not mean you have to let someone back into your life. And one of the commenters in one of my videos the other day, they said when I mentioned forgiveness, because I talked about what I believe forgiveness to be, that I could really say acceptance. And it's pretty close. That person made a good point. That's pretty close. But I think whether it's forgiveness or acceptance, whatever we call it, we do that for ourselves. And we do that because we don't want to hold on to resentment. But when we're resentful towards what happened and we're really angry about it, even if we don't talk to them anymore, that only serves to hurt us at that point. And who does that benefit? I don't think that benefits anybody. In my coaching program, and I help people to practice radical self-respect, to me, I'm all for people having the mindset towards something that best helps them today. What helps you to be the best version of yourself? What helps you to be the happiest and healthiest version of yourself? And whatever way you can see it that helps you do that, I am all for. Because once the bad things have happened, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. What else can you do? There's nothing else you can do except accept. I mean, you can hold on to resentment if you want to, but I don't know how that helps. I don't know how that helps you be a happier person or a more productive person or a more emotionally healthy person. I don't think it does. But I think acceptance can. Accepting the things that we cannot change, I think that can. And I think when we look at it in a way that helps us to let go, and I think that line from Linkin Park's Numb, knowing that they were just like you in a situation where their narcissistic parent was treating them in a similar way, to me, that helped with my acceptance to think, yeah, maybe they were doing the best they could. Maybe they even weren't. But regardless, it doesn't matter. I think acceptance is the way. But if someone's parents are like too abusive, yeah, I would say cut them off in that case. But there's a lot of different moving parts and dynamics here because there's a lot of different varieties of narcissistic parents. Like I said, there's the military parents, the police parents, the college professors, the teachers, the spiritual gurus, the yogis, the religious ones, the athletes, the musicians, the art folks. They come in all shapes and sizes. They can be in any profession. But one thing is for sure, they do prefer to gravitate towards professions that have a built-in level of authority and power. And that's usually what? People in politics, in the police department, sometimes in the military, if you move up the ranks, or business CEOs, etc., they have that built-in level of power. And again, a lot of this depends on what their favorite version of supply is. The business tycoon, maybe he's more of an absent father. And his big thing is being a captain of industry and really kicking butt in the financial world and trying to kick the butt of his competitors. And that's where he gets his supply. And maybe he has some affairs on the side. Other ones, though, maybe they're not as successful in their own life, but then they take that out on their kids. I see this a lot in the former athlete narcissistic parents where they're not a narcissistic or they're not an athlete right now, but maybe they were a high school athlete or a college athlete. They want their kids to do better than they did. And those narcissistic parents, they will try to live through the kids. And they will try to get the kids to live in a way and to do the things that they never got to do. And what they're doing with this is they're trying to heal their own wounds through their kids. Now, I don't think they're doing this consciously, but that is what's going on. And or if your parents didn't go to college, for example, your parents might be obsessed with you going to college. And they think, you need to go because I didn't go. And everything's all better if you go to college. Now, we know in this day and age, that's not always the case anymore. You better get a degree in a good thing that's going to lead to a skill, or you're just going to be left with a hunk of student loan debt. But the narcissistic parent will try to live through their kids when they're kind of not getting the kinds of supply that they want from their own life. But the narcissists that are doing amazing, whether they're an athlete or a musician, they're probably more likely to be the more absent parents. And they might be still bullying and controlling when they spend time with them, but the time they spend with them might be few and far between. It just really all depends. But there's a lot of stuff to go over here, and I think if you got this far, please remember to subscribe to the channel, like the video if you did like the video, Share this with others that you think might benefit, and comment below the specific kinds of dynamics you want to see me go over with narcissistic parents, because there's so many different versions of things to go over. There's the narcissistic parent that's an adult that interferes in their adult children's romantic relationships, or interferes with their adult children's career choices or how they parent their kids. There's all sorts of things and different dynamics that are going on here. But either way, it almost always causes some damage and it causes some wounds. And if someone hasn't worked on them, if they haven't taken the effort to recognize the situation, they're probably stuck in that trauma. And Neil Strauss, someone that I've seen before in Malibu, he said that if you continually get the same results you're trying to avoid, a trauma is at play. And that's one of the miracles of the romantic relationship with a narcissist. The miracle is, if you pay attention and you take a look at your own side of the street, you can learn, oh, there's some work I can be doing on myself. And you might notice the dynamics for what they really are for the first time. You think, oh yeah, wow, I see the dynamics now. I see how they treated me and my siblings, and the controlling and the belittling and the gaslighting and manipulation. You see it. And that's the advantage. If there is an advantage of being in a narcissistic relationship growing up, that is it. Because, and that's the other part of it too, whether, even if something's not your fault, these two things can be true at the same time. If someone mistreats you in a romantic relationship, that's not your fault. And if you're consistently attracting people, though, that are mistreating you, that leads me to believe there probably is some work you can be doing on yourself. Maybe it's learning how to walk away. Maybe it's learning how to spot those red flags. Or some people can spot them, but then they ignore them because maybe the person's fun or attractive or whatever. If we don't act on those red flags, it doesn't really matter if we can spot them. Talk about those red flags. Once you find them, get to the bottom of them, unless the red flag is so egregious that you should just walk away. But be able to walk away, be able to say no, be able to place boundaries, and understand that sometimes healthy can feel boring if you're used to that kind of up and down emotional roller coaster environment. And that's the hardest part for a lot of people, just getting to that place where they're in a healthy relationship and they know love is a feeling. Or excuse me, love is not just a feeling. Love is in the actions that we do. And I was talking to someone tonight. She said love is an energy. But I said that unless that energy is being shown in actions, to me, that's not the best. But to someone else, maybe they only need to know about the energy. But that's not me. But love will come out in our actions. And the feeling of love, that can come and go. Feelings are fickle. But the actions, if we truly love somebody, I think our actions will show it. And at that point, and that's one of my fears too, it's one of my few fears in relationships. It's that if someone loses the feeling of love, that they'll leave. Now, part of that for me is that's a little bit of a fear of abandonment for one. But I also have to know if people are supposed to be in my life, they're going to be in my life. And I have to have that level of acceptance. Me even worrying for a minute about, what if someone has the feeling of love and then it goes away and then they leave? What's the point of me even thinking about that for a second? Worrying is nothing more than a negative meditation. The only good thing worrying can ever do, and this is only sometimes, is it can prompt people to act. And if you didn't worry, and then that's the only thing, the reason why you prompted yourself to act, that's the only benefit of worrying I can see. But for the most part, it is that negative meditation, and there's no use. And as our buddy Axl Rose said, worrying's a waste of my effing time. Hell yeah, it is. Hell yeah, it is. Don't even worry about it. Don't even worry about worrying. But yeah, so there's a lot of different moving parts here, because this dynamic with narcissistic parents, it touches everything. It touches on every aspect of your life, especially when they were one of your primary caregivers. They touched on every area, and it's very difficult to be unscathed from that whole situation. There's going to be some residual damage. And then it's just a matter of, did you wake up to it? Did you put in the work on yourself? Are you conscious of it? Are you aware of yourself and your attachment styles and your boundaries and what you want from life? Or did you just put your head down and do what you were told and just kind of lived life on autopilot, trying to please other people instead of trying to please yourself? I've seen both. And that's the other tricky part about codependents too. They'll put other people's needs first, but they are also getting their own needs met by putting other people's needs first. I learned that from Teal Swan. I'm going to try to get Teal Swan on the channel here too. I've been trying to get into some of her books. Some of it's a little far out there for me, but a lot of her YouTube content is pretty good in my opinion. Now, people do smear her a little bit, but they'll smear her about her past or something. But to me, that's irrelevant. It's like, I don't care. We've all had a checkered past. It's like, how are you living today? What's your knowledge? How are you teaching it? Are you living it? That's really what I care about. And if your stuff helps me, it helps me. I don't care what you did years ago. I don't care if you struggled with alcohol before. I know I've had my demons for sure. I've struggled with addictions. I've struggled with all sorts of things. But I think for me, it's helped me on my healing journey. And it gave me the excuse before a narcissistic relationship ever did to work on myself. The narcissistic relationship part, that happened to me later in life. But first, it was addiction. First, it was anxiety and mental health. And for me personally, I think it was because I was probably high functioning on the spectrum, maybe Asperger's, but I was undiagnosed. I was undiagnosed, and they say if you had undiagnosed autism, it is likely or possible that it can turn into borderline personality disorder. And that's not impossible to me either. I think that makes sense. But there's a lot of stuff going on here. There's a lot of moving parts with all of this stuff, but the obstacle can be the way. When we go and try to tackle our issues, whatever those issues may be, I think they can act as signposts pointing us in the right direction. And a lot of people that are maybe in a bad spot now, try to think of it like this. Those are all opportunities to grow. Like what you're going through now, if you find your way out, you can then help other people to get out of the same hole that you're in now. In NA, they have a saying, you can only keep what you have by giving it away. I think that's appropriate. And the people on NA, they help people get clean. And it's because they know best because they've been there themselves. So they help people to do what they have already done. And I think that's same basic formula is true for many things, whether it's narcissistic relationships, gambling, love and sex addiction, fill in the blank with whatever demon or issue it is, eating disorders. There's a way to go through it. And the people who can best help, in my opinion, usually are the ones who have been there themselves. Now, that's not to say people who haven't been there can be of no help. I still think they can be of some help, but the people who have struggled with addiction, usually they're going to relate most to someone who's also been there. That's just been my experience with it. But we're kind of getting off the track here. This was about narcissistic parents. I did go over a lot of aspects of narcissistic parents. I'm trying to do more lives here too, and I might start doing some more Q&As because I want this to be more interactive instead of me just speaking into the camera and without any opportunity for back and forth. That's the advantage of doing lives here, is that there can be back and forth. If people wanted to do super chats, they could, and I would answer those questions on the screen. That all helps me too. But I don't mind doing the videos as well. The advantage of the videos will be they'll probably be more concise, and they won't be me freeballing as much as I do on a live. But when I go on a live, I just try to give myself some bullet points, and I go towards those bullet points. But inevitably, as I talk, things just come out. And I start talking about different things. I go on streams of consciousness. And when I do a recorded video, That's not usually how that goes. Maybe some people like the videos better, but I put this to a poll and the vast majority said they wanted more lives. So here we are. We're doing a live. But I think that's about it for now. Let me know what you thought about this video. Share this with someone that you think might benefit. And thank you very much for watching.